Right, welcome, Louis de Bernières, to Hambledon, although it'd be more appropriate to say welcome back, because this is the village of your childhood and the village setting for your book, notwithstanding. And in this interview with the Hambledon Village website, I would like to ask you about your time here. But first, in your book, notwithstanding, you pose a question, I think it's fair to say. Are villages like Hambledon changing, losing their character, their heart and soul, becoming dormitories for office workers who commute to the towns and cities? Now you're back in our little village here in the Surrey Hills. Has it changed? Has Hambledon withstood?
I think it has withstood. I called it notwithstanding because when I was writing those stories a long time ago, I thought the village had not withstood. And for another reason too, which is that English villages often have rather strange and interesting names, like Blissworthy,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought notwithstanding would be a good English name. But as I came back more often after I'd written the book, and I realised that actually the village is the same. It's just that the personnel are changing. When I was young, it already was a dormitory village in many ways. I have fond memories of armies of commuters with black rolled up umbrellas and bowler hats and pinstripe suits marching up New Road to the railway station, and then coming back in the evening, usually a little bit plastered, because you could. And my dad was one of those. Yeah. And I don't know if armies of commuters still march up that road. They probably drive now. It always was a bit of a dormitory village, but that had the effect of making it into a matriarchy, because the women were at home, and with the children and so on. And the men were sort of. My father, I sometimes thought he was a bit of a ghost. He turned up after I was in bed and was there at weekends.
Well, I'm sure it's still much like that, and you reflect on a rural idyll, and you wonder, in fact, whether it ever was in your time a rural idyll, or perhaps that had gone. The days of milkmaids and people having pigs in the yard, that had gone, but there were still real Surrey characters here with Surrey accents when you first arrived.
Yes, there was still a little bit. Another thing that made me think that the village was going to pot was when somebody moved in and started protesting about the cockerels. I thought, if you don't like cockerels, don't live in the country. I remember two people with a strong Surrey accent. One was called Walter, and the other one was Jack Thorne, who died not all that long ago, actually. But he had a proper Surrey accent with the post-vocalic R and so on. It reminded me, it probably would remind you of Dorset. But I don't know if anyone still uses that accent at all.
There was a lovely old lady called Rosemary Sage, always known as Aunt Rose, who lived in the far corner of the cricket green. And I'd lived there most of her life. And she died, I think, at age 101, 102. And she still had a very distinct Surrey accent. But a lot of the people who live here now are people who've moved in many cases from some distance. But I sense, having lived in Hambledon for 30 years, there's a real community spirit here. We've resurrected the village shop. The primary school closed. I'm sure you remember it as a functioning school in your day, but now it's a nursery school. So we have tried to retain those essential ingredients of village life, but often run by outsiders now by comparison to who would have lived here in your day and before.
Well, there are still, I think, plenty of families here who were here when I was. And we were incomers, so everyone is an incomer at some time. If I've been in my village in Norfolk for 16 years, and I'm only just beginning to feel like, an insider.
So when did you come to Hambledon, and what were the circumstances?
I've been trying to remember, and I've noticed recently that my memories are often false. You tend to mythologise your own past. But I think I was roughly 9 years old, or 9 or 10, and we'd been an army family, had been all over the place. We lived for a while in Orpington in Kent, and for a little while with my grandmother in Eltham. Then I think we moved here when I was about 9, and my parents left, I suppose, when I was in my early mid-30s. So I think of Hambledon as the place where I grew up.
Yeah. And when you were 9, what would that have been in the 1960s or?
Well, I was born in 1954, so it would have been roughly 1963, 64, yes. Right.
And physically, going around the village, as you perhaps have done over the last day or two, do you notice a lot of difference? Physically, it's still the same?
No, it's the same. It's extraordinarily the same. It's almost spooky. I just went up to the churchyard, and the two steps at the bottom of the path along the church wall?
Yes.
Those Bargate steps, I built those.
Did you?
Well, because I got through my 20s as a landscape gardener. So I I made those steps because everyone was fed up with skidding down the last little bit of the path. And all the paths on Court Farm next door were relayed by me. So I'm rather amazed that after all these years it's all still intact. But it is the same, yeah.
And you came here around about the age of 9,
Yeah.
and you say your final links with the village you would have been in your 30s, but by then you'd obviously moved away.
Yes.
You didn't go to school in the village, you went to boarding school, which you acknowledge in your book meant that you were absent from the village for quite a long period. But one thing that strikes me, and I think this is a generational thing, is that you knew the village intimately. You knew every lane, you knew every pond, you knew every stream, which I think youngsters of our generation did because we didn't have the distractions of computer games, and you spent a lot more time outside. Your book comes across with a real affection for the village and a real knowledge, the ponds where you'd find the pike,
Yes.
you know, all those things. I mean, you obviously knew Hambledon really well.
I did, and it was largely because in our family we had an absolutely rigid rule that the dog had to be walked every day. We had golden retrievers, so even if it was belting with rain or snowing, you'd take the dog out. And I got to know the whole area very intimately for a very long distance. You know, we would go around Sweetwater, for example, or up on Hyden's Ball. I knew all of these places extremely well, and I think it gave me a fairly deep love for nature and a sort of an accidental knowledge of it too.
And you say in your book that you wrote it for your son and daughter, and you hope
Yes.
that they too would have that sort of growing up. Do you feel you've managed to achieve that? You're now living in Norfolk, I believe.
I live in South Norfolk, in a village which is, I suppose by Southern English standards, very behind the times. For example, it's much more socially mixed than Hambledon because it's not a commuter village. We have plenty of peasants left, you know,
Yeah.
and so it's more socially mixed, and the dialect is still intact. You don't say I go, you go oi goo, you know, and it has the sort of feeling of a village that I want my children to grow up with, so that even if they're living in London, they still feel rooted somewhere.
But did you notice whether their pastimes were similar to yours or really quite different?
They are reasonably similar, actually. They are only glued to screens when it's raining. Luckily, I live next to some neighbours with 3 kids, and so we're a colony, and my children have, you know, I mean, we're all inundated with children and bashing each other or falling in the paddling pool. And when the weather's nice, they're outdoors. Not least because I kick them out. But I think one reason why children get bogged down indoors is that their parents do. I find if I go out, the children go out. You won't achieve anything with children if you don't set an example.
No. Going back to some of the characters in your book,
Yeah.
I think you actually acknowledge they were, to an extent, invented in as much as it's what might have been,
Yeah.
not necessarily what was. But nevertheless, these were modelled on real people and quite eccentric characters that you knew in the village?
Absolutely. I could easily tell you which ones were based on real people and which ones weren't. For example, the ghost story in there about Sir Edward.
Yes.
I actually got that from a vicar in Buxton who told it to me, and I said, can I have it? And I simply moved it to Hambledon.
Right.
But I put it in the Hambledon Rectory, and I put it at St. Peter's Church. You know, so I moved it here. Other stories, I felt that in the interests of, shall we say, metaphorical or poetic truth, I could lie as much as I wanted or mix things up as much as I wanted. So, for example, General Martin, when he died in a nursing home, he did die believing it was his. And that's why the story is called The Happy Death of the General.
Yeah, yeah.
But he didn't have the habit of wandering around naked. The man whose nakedness impressed me was Kit Wilson. They had a little swimming pool opposite their house, and Kit used to love cavorting in it with no clothes on, which I suppose was quite audacious back then.
Yeah.
And he wasn't in the least bit nutty or eccentric in any way, Kit. So, you know, I gave the general Kit's, you know, nakedness, and so things got awfully mixed up.
Yeah. So you took components of people that you knew around the
Yeah.
village and perhaps put them into one person.
I was interested in the spirit of the place rather than in the detail. I wasn't writing a social history. I was trying to catch the spirit of the place in the same way that Dylan Thomas was with Undermilt Wood.
You don't name Hambledon anywhere in the book, but
No.
Chiddingfold, other nearby places, the Mary Harris with the Labour voting landlord and the chamber pots, sadly all gone now, Scott's country stores, all these places you name.
But Fremantle's coal yard.
Yes, the coal yard is gone now, sadly. So it would be easy to place Hambledon, although interestingly I noticed on Wikipedia they have you as being writing about Wormley, which of course is just up the road. Yeah, they have Wormley as your place of growing up. But it was Hambledon, clearly.
Of course it was,
It is Hambledon. Was it just because you could toy with the name notwithstanding that you decided not to use the name Hambledon, or did you want to protect Hambledon in some way?
I wanted to protect Hambledon up to a point. I mean, I knew it would come out in the end. And there are points, I think there are occasions when I refer to Chiddingfold as Abbott's notwithstanding.
Yes.
But it was because I liked the quirky names of some English villages, and because I thought wrongly that the village hadn't withstood.
And in the book, how much of it is you? There's the wandering minstrel with the Morris Minor, there's the lad who caught the girt pike, there's the gardener. Are these you?
Some of them are, and some of them are me changed into someone else. So, the little boy who caught the pike in the Glebe Pond was me. Beetle Nation asked me to catch it for her because it was eating her ducklings, and she was really impressed. And I always remember the embarrassment of wading out of the pond with no trousers on, because I'd had to disentangle it from the lily pad.
So that was you?
That was me, but I gave the victory to a little boy called Robert from Cherryhurst, from the council houses. And again, that was because I wanted the thing to be more socially inclusive. You know, not just about middle-class people like myself.
No.
So Robert is quite important. And I give Robert the pet jackdaw, which is something that I had. I had the pet rook.
Yes.
I actually had a jackdaw, but in the story it's a rook. The reason for that is that I have a rookery in my garden, and every year I bring up the fallen ones. So I now know more about rooks than I do about jackdaws. So you can see how things get changed in the writer's imagination.
And the boy who caught the girt pike, we now know to be you, had guilt for the rest of his days,
yes.
did he not?
Yeah, very much so, yes.
Because it was such a splendid creature and you were responsible for its demise. It
was astonishingly beautiful when it first came out of the water. And I've remained a countryman all my life. I mean, I do have shotguns and a deer rifle, but I've never ever got over the guilt of seeing the light go out in an animal's eyes. Yeah. And for that reason I never shoot unless the deep freeze is empty, you know what I mean? I really think that we mustn't lose the liberties we used to have. There's a walk on the way to Sweetwater where there's now a fence up, where we just used to take the dog as a matter of, habit. And that sort of fencing off and inhibiting of life, I think, is something I would more associate with towns than villages.
Kids should spend their time up trees growing up.
Exactly. I always say to the children's mother, if they're not dirty, they're not happy.
And you went on to write some tremendous books. You came back to write about Hambledon some way in your writing career. Was the writer in you when you were still in Hambledon? Was there any inspiration apart from Notwithstanding? I mean, did you see your life's course? I knew many other things, I believe.
Well, I knew I was going to be a writer from the age of 12. And Hambledon had quite an effect on me. I vividly remember trying to start a novel which I was writing in red ink, which was set in the village, but it was all about squires and milkmaids. It was very anachronistic, and I realised quite quickly that it wasn't really up my street. I wrote the first draft of my first novel in my bedroom at Arran Lodge.
But was that after you'd returned from Colombia, or was
yes,
it? Yes,
after Colombia, yeah.
It seems that you take inspiration from where you go. You've already told me you keep a couple of notebooks in each pocket, so you're the sort of person who presumably jots things down as you go around.
Yes, and sometimes entire poems come to me. I was in the graveyard just now, and last time I was here I wrote a poem about the grave of Lucy Parker, who's a sparkly, pretty young woman, who died much too young, and I didn't know she'd died. I came across her grave, and it was such a shock, and I wrote a poem about it, which I must remember to send to Mary if it wouldn't upset her too much.
It's of that Parker family.
What?
Lucy was of that Parker family, right?
Yeah, she was. She died young of cancer. I met a Frenchman in the south of France at a Salon de Livre in Pau, and he said this conversation was in French, but he said, I just adore England. And I said, why? And he said, because it's so exotic. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, if I go to Belgium or France or Holland, they just all seem the same. But he said, l'Angleterre, c'est un asile immense. England is an immense lunatic asylum. And I thought, gosh, he's right. When you grow up in a place, you think it's normal.
Yeah.
But Hambledon had a lot of very interesting characters. It probably still does. I mean, the woman next door to me, Molly Gabb, had her house full of animals, no carpets. The whole place stank of cats. And you dreaded being offered a cup of tea.
Again, all this in your book, a real person.
Yeah, she features as Agatha Feeks.
Yes.
But I give her a romance I don't know if she ever had, you know, with an airman during the war.
Mm. Dropping the roses on the garden and dipping the wings of the aircraft.
Yeah, because there was an airfield at Dunsfold.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And why did you then, was it just the inspiration of this Frenchman that made you think, actually, my own doorstep is as interesting as South America or as
My problem was simply that if something is normal, you don't perceive what's interesting about it. And he made me see my own country with new eyes. It was a tremendously helpful comment.
And some of the stories in Notwithstanding, you had already written for various publications, and I think one had been broadcast. But at that point, you decided to bring them all together and add to them.
It was my agent, really. She said, I think you've got enough of these stories to make a book. And I realised that I did. Producing the book was almost no effort at all, because the stories had already been written over the decades.
Yeah.
I think I wrote a couple more. There was one inspired by an incident in Norfolk. You know, the ones about the Notwithstanding Wing Quartet.
Yes.
I saw a pheasant just stuck in a hedge with its tail sticking out, and I was learning the oboe at the time, and so I stopped and took the tail feathers, because you use the tail feathers to clean your oboe, and I thought that's what gave rise to 3 or 4 of those stories.
So actually, that was a Norfolk situation, which you
but
brought into
it could just as easily have happened here.
Mm. And you were playing instruments when you were in Hambledon. You'd grown up.
Yes. I learnt. I fell deeply in love with the folk guitar and the classical guitar when I was a young boy here. I spent hours in my bedroom learning to play ragtime and Bob Dylan songs and so on.
And in the book, there's a teacher from King Edward School.
Yeah.
Was that for real?
No.
No.
No, but it could have been.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. No, I mean, and of course, for those of us who live here, it is a bit of a guessing game. I mean, I'm sure when the book came out, a lot of people tried to put faces to your names.
Well, quite understandably.
Yeah.
And, you know, there is a list of the dead at the end of the book who I didn't want to forget. And it often happens when I've written a book that people will write in and say, I knew Captain Corelli, but he played the piano. You quite often guess accurately about characters you didn't know existed.
Mm. I read somewhere that Captain Corelli came about because you and I think your partner were regularly taking your Morris Minor Traveller on camping trips to France.
Yeah.
And she said, why can't we go somewhere else?
Yeah, she got really fed up with camping in France with my Morris Minor.
So I think you said, okay, you choose somewhere. It happened to be Greece, and that was the genesis for Captain Corelli's.
Yeah, she was responsible for Birds Without Wings as well, because she wanted to go to Turkey.
Right.
But the Morris Minor, I bought from a man in Effingham originally, and then I had a hideous car crash, and I had to I rebuilt it out of two other Morris Minors. With quite a lot of spares from Alfie Hammond's scrapyard on the edge of the village green, which isn't there anymore. But Alfie was a tremendous asset to any youngster with a knackered car.
Well, Alfie's still there, but
yes.
it's no longer a scrapyard.
Yeah.
I think.
I loved his friendly Alsatians that were just caked in oil and mud.
Mm. I had one firmly clasped to my ankle once when I went round there to buy something from him.
Yes. So he had a power washer that was so powerful it actually blew the paintwork off my motorbike.
The Morris Minor that you had in the village is still in part the one you're driving around in now?
I'm still driving the same car, yes. I was thinking of being buried in it.
Do you feel you're someone who is, I mean, you obviously have a nostalgia for the past and you've drawn on the past for what you write about. But you don't clearly live in the past. You have a young family and, you know, a very active life. But nostalgia is important for you?
Nostalgia is important, yes. I actually agree with that Bob Dylan line that he who is not busy being born is busy dying. and I'm not ready to start dying. I keep busy, I keep myself interested in new things, but at the same time, I do have quite a painful nostalgia for Hambledon. And
I think
I did have the chance. I mean, a few years ago, the house where we used to live came up for sale. But then I remembered that we'd lost something like 10 cats on the main road. I thought, you know, if I got a choice between the family house and the lives of my cats, I'm afraid I got to choose the cats.
Well, that would perhaps be the one disadvantage of that house, was that it did face on to, I mean, there aren't many busy roads in Hambledon village, but of course, there you're on the Petworth
People
road,
still
so.
hurtle through the narrow bit, don't they?
They
I
do,
nearly had a crash on the way here.
Well, we have lost the nuns in their Morris Minors careering out of St Dominic's.
Yes, they were a real liability.
All of your stories, often, well, most of the stories I think in the book, there are recurring. You know, in passing, there go the nuns careering around in their Morris Minor, you know, believing in their faith to keep them safe, let alone anyone else who's near them. And then there's the not so much the road mender, but
the hedging and ditching man. That was completely deliberate because I wanted it to have the atmosphere of a novel, even though it was actually a collection of short stories. And the way I did that was to include people in other people's stories. And the hedging and ditching man is an obvious one. I remember him. I've still got a sheep skull that he gave me. And as a result, my son is now obsessed with collecting skulls. You know, we have to put dead animals' heads under flower pots so they can be demolished by maggots. It's all lovely. But anyway, that's because of him. I have no idea who he was.
But he did exist.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. He was always there in the ditch or cutting the hedge. And there's another. For example, when the boy is in Palmer's music shop in Godalming, the general goes by outside.
Yes.
You know. So I tried to include people in each other's stories.
I was told the hedging and ditching man used to keep his cup in the bus shelter at the Hydestyle in the village where I live. So he was in memory, but he didn't exist when I moved here in 1987. No. But he was, I mean, they were real. That's why villages tended to be so well organised, and why ditches didn't flood and roads didn't get flooded, is because the ditches were regularly cleared.
Yeah. We
now have to do battle with Surrey County Council to get them to do it once a year.
It's always better to do it yourself if you can. My mother found her first ever pornography magazine in that bus shelter. She was utterly horrified.
Well, I think that's gone, as sadly has the cup and the hedging and ditching man. I think you said to me last night that you were actually going to add a couple more chapters to Notwithstanding, so can we look forward to
Yes, when the present edition runs out and he's reprinting, there'll be 2 extra stories. One is based on something that actually did happen to me, and the other is a very, very hysterically funny story which I'm afraid is from Norfolk. And I originally wrote it set in Norfolk, and then I thought, well, this is obviously could have happened in Hambledon. So I moved it here. It's about a dead dog. The other story, my mother used to let me reverse her Mini out of the garage when she wanted to go out. So I learnt to drive backwards before I learnt to go forwards, which is really a bit Irish, isn't it? And we've got a lot in common with the Irish. The Irish love Notwithstanding, because they see their own villages there.
I'm sure they do.
And anyway, my father had this fetish for building little brick walls around all the flower beds. And he built a little brick wall around the rose bed on the driveway. And of course I reversed my mother's Mini into it. And I was so scared or frightened, you know, I think I went to Wales and came back when I thought he'd cool off. And he just stood there in the driveway and pointed to the wall, and that was all he had to do, really.
And when will the reissue of the book come out, do you know?
It just depends on when the present edition sells out. The American edition has got it in already.
Oh, right.
But I don't quite know when it'll happen here.
And
I mean, there may be more stories. I don't see why not.
Well, I wondered whether today is going to provide you with anything. I mean, you're here today, amongst other things, to open the village Fete in a little while from now.
Yeah.
The Fete was something you remember? It was very much an activity that was around when you were here.
It wasn't the village Fete back then, it was the Conservative Fete.
What a surprise.
Somewhere along the line it's got changed, yes.
So it wasn't what the Conservative Association used to run the Fete? Or
I think they did, yes.
Yeah.
I remember my parents being involved, particularly my mother. She was a very staunch Conservative until she both my parents actually felt more and more deceived by the Euro vote under Ted Heath. Because they'd voted for a single market and they got something else. So as they got older, they became less and less enamoured of the Conservatives, but mainly because of Ted Heath.
Well, the village fete, I don't think has any political.
No, it wouldn't now.
Although
No.
you might be able to guess the politics of most of the people who are there. But
Yeah.
you mentioned Ron Beasley, of course, was the Labour voting landlord of the
yeah.
Merry Harriers, and he came off the buses from Roehampton to take over running a pub in a village. So even the incomers can bring some eccentricity to them.
Yeah, you know, I seem to remember in the public bar, you used to get old blokes with their shotguns leaning up against the wall when I was a kid. You weren't, obviously I wasn't allowed in under 15, or whenever it was, but I still did. We used to go in there and drink cider. Ron was a very friendly landlord, you know, and his daughter was attractive in a buxom sort of way, you know.
Sue,
that's right, yes. And his son used to scramble motorbikes. Colin, yeah.
I spoke to him today.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've got happy memories of going there with my friend Stephen Wolford. He was my only non-middle class friend in the village.
Now, was that Stephen who came from Norway or Sweden?
Sweden. His mother was Swedish.
Yes.
His father was Buzz Wolford, who was a waterboard man. And Buzz spent most of his life in the Chiddingfold ex-servicemen's club, drinking barley wine and whiskey chasers. So I was down there quite a lot with Stephen as well.
I think, Stephen knew our house at the Hyde Stile Crossroads because it used to belong to the hospital, and I think Stephen worked up at the hospital.
Stephen lived in that little house on
That's
the
right,
crossroads
yeah.
with his first wife.
Yeah.
Yes, whose name I've forgotten. He had a cat called Rover. Stephen's back in Sweden now, and we're still in touch.
He has visited occasionally back to Hambledon. And as for you, leaving finally in your early 30s, when you would only have been a visitor by that stage, but having grown up here, how often do you return to Hambledon? Did you feel the need to return when putting together Notwithstanding?
I came back several times fairly anonymously, except I bumped into Mandy Sullivan in the village shop. She's Amanda somebody else now.
Yes.
And I always go to the graveyard to see who's died. So I'm more likely to go home with a poem in my pocket than a story. So yes, I did come back several times, and I walked the same walks as I used to do with our dogs.
And that would be the Buses Common and Hyde and Ball.
Yeah, yeah. We also used to. I was a junior member of the West Surrey Golf Club, and they didn't care in those days if you took your dog when you went golfing. And there was a lovely little 9-hole course at Shillingley, where I used to take the dog, and gave me the idea for a couple of the Archie stories in that book. If you've got a dog who picks up other people's golf balls, you meet a lot of people. I think I'm 61 or 2 now, I can't remember which, and it's strange coming back to a place where everything is the same, but all the people have changed. People who knew me must look at me with the same kind of shock as I look at them, because we remember each other as much, much younger. And it's a bit like being the ghost of yourself.
It is. I think if I conclude anything from your book, in fact, it's, yes, villages are changing, and they've always changed, and they will continue to change. It's the people is the biggest change. We've talked about the structure of the village, the physical buildings. They haven't really changed. Perhaps some are a bit prettier, neater, not so smelly as they might have been. But essentially the village looks the same. But if you get into the heart of the village, it's always the people. Yes. And clearly a lot of the people that you very fondly remember from your growing up are now in that churchyard.
Yeah.
And just going back to the incomers who perhaps coveted some of these lovely little Surrey workers' cottages, which were very much 2 up, 2 down, but the potential for it to be turned into a des res, that happens everywhere. But as you point out, Hambledon, with its sort of easy travel links up to London from Milford and Whitley stations, perhaps we've suffered a bit more from that.
I don't think it's right to call it suffering. No, it just means that your social structure is going to be quite different from, say, a village in Norfolk. I wouldn't say it's any better or worse, but I think that there can be a problem in places which are very predominantly middle class, which is that you grow up probably never even knowing anybody working class, especially if you went to a boarding school, and the only working class people you come across are the people sort of delivering the milk bottles or something. You know, it means that you are artificially excluded from the rest of British society. That's the downside of it.
Mm.
I was rescued from that situation by Stefan becoming my best friend.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But I could easily have, say, gone to Oxford and Cambridge and into a posh job in accountancy or something, and just have no idea how the other half live.
And there probably was more of another half in Hambledon then.
I think there was. In those days, the Hydrological Institute, if it's still there, was the Hambledon Homes.
Yeah, the oceanography.
The Oceanography.
Yeah.
The Oceanography
That's
Institute. Well, before that, it was the Hambledon Homes, which was really an orphanage.
Yes, and there was a workhouse.
And
there as
before
well.
that, it was a workhouse.
Yeah.
So we had those slightly feral children up Cherryhurst, and there were battles. You know, I remember one battle where we were hurling stones at each other, and I injured a kid on the forehead, and I was so horrified by what I'd done. I think I've never thrown a stone since.
So the village has changed, the people have changed, but physically it's much the same. You're going to end your day today on the village green, opening the Fete. You would expect still to know quite a few people from your time here when you're wandering around on the
There are a tremendous number of people. I went to the Jane Woolley's party last night, and there were lots and lots of people, and I was not short of anyone to talk to.
And no awkwardness in coming back to Hambledon, seeing as you've written about these eccentric characters, although we've acknowledged that they were components of various people. But
no, people have been quite gracious about it. I mean, I think it does take some effort of imagination to realise that writers distort the truth in the interests of making a better story. So if somebody recognises themselves, it doesn't mean that I'm actually trying to tell the truth about them. I'm not. I'm trying to tell lies.
Well, Louis, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day in the village, and we look forward to seeing you on the village green.
Thank you very much. It's
Thank
been
you.
fun.